So the question that I always used to have teaching South Asian history or Indian history at the University of Winnipeg was, how do I enable my students to experience India or South Asia more generally in Winnipeg? It's really hard, right? Apart from showing them films or pictures. So in about 2010, I started teaching a course on the history of the diaspora. In other words, all of those people who left India from about 1800 onwards. Then there's a large number of people who left India long before 1800, but I thought this was going to be enough. So this is actually coded as a world history course, not a South Asian history course, okay, for those who are interested in the distinction. Okay, so it's basically a lot of comparative history. So my aim, since I applied for a experiential learning grant in 2023, was to basically show my students how we have so many different South Asian cultures in Winnipeg. So all the migrations that have occurred, especially since 1800, you can see that people have come to Winnipeg, often as what we call twice or even third migrations. Anyway, I'll explain. So let me move to my next. So in this course, we look at a whole series of migrations from South Asia to Southeast Asia, to South Africa, to East Africa, to Canada, the USA, to Britain, and to the Caribbean. Yes, all in a condensed course of only 6 weeks, this summer, in fact. But I'm now talking about last summer, when I also taught the course in June. So there are 7 modules. First of all, I talk about the late 18th century, early 19th century migrants and travelers who came largely to Europe from India. These were either highly elite people or they were very low status people, okay? And some of these people are very interesting. I'll talk about some of them a little bit. Merchants and trading communities. I was just talking to a student in my office who's from Gujarat, and he did know about the merchant and trading communities that are Gujarati from the west coast of India who went across the Indian Ocean to Africa for many generations. Then we talk about indentured labor migration. Now, if you're in Winnipeg and you've met somebody who looks Indian but speaks with an accent from the Caribbean, you have met somebody whose ancestors traveled as indentured migrants to the Caribbean, but that's only one place that indentured laborers were taken. Okay? They were also taken to South Africa, to East Africa, to Fiji, and under a different scheme, in fact, to Southeast Asia. So I'm going to talk about that in a minute again. Then we have a separate section on colonial Africa, and particularly we talk about the expulsion of Asians from Uganda. Then we talk about how Indian nationalism was expressed in places outside of India, because of course this was the only place that was safe to express Indian nationalist sentiments. And the revolutionary Gadda movement, which was led by Punjabis and Bengalis, that movement was actually started in North America, which is very interesting. Okay? And it coincides, just prior to the First World War, and ends, in fact, with something that we should all know about as Canadians, which is the Komagatu Maru incident, which occurred in Vancouver, which we talk about also. Then I talk about post-war migration and post-partition migration to Britain. And then we end up talking about North America, which is in fact the last section of the course. Okay? So I'd like to show you, since I'm very grateful for the 2 experiential learning grants that I've had so far, in 2023 and 2024, in subsequent and separate years, I interviewed my friend Girish, who is from, he is from the Gujarati community, okay? But he's not from Gujarat. Students who I took to interview him And he used to run, actually, I've just discovered that he's recently retired, he used to run Guggen Fresh Fruits on Ellis. But his story is extraordinary. And it's a good way to show students just how, well, complicated migrant stories can be. His grandfather emigrated to Mogadishu, Somalia, right? From Karachi, actually, in what is today Pakistan. Then he and his family were kicked out of Somalia in the late 80s, 1980s, leaving with the shirts on their backs and what was in their bank accounts. Okay? They went to Kenya. Okay? Then they left Kenya because there were no opportunities and ended up, strangely enough, ironically enough, in Uganda, 20 years after Idi Amin's expulsion of Ugandan Asians. There they established themselves, ran a new business, and eventually came to Winnipeg in 2005, which is when I met him, and established himself eventually here because his mother and brother were already here. Okay, that is one example of what, well, a modern merchant and trading family's trajectory looked like. I used the 2 interviews with Girish for the online students, because I teach this course in person and online, for the online students to look at the example of oral history and to see how differently Girish answered the same questions that I put to him in 2 subsequent years. Okay, we have the recordings. Indentured migration. So I lecture about indentured migration, which, by the way, is one of the areas of my own research. And then with the community, actually since 2023, I, with various members of the community, who I'll show you in a minute, have organized Indian Arrival Day. And this was to show my students what the Indo-Caribbean community is like, what they celebrate, and how amazing they are. Now, Indian Arrival Day is not the Indian arrival in Winnipeg. Indian arrival is Indian arrival under indenture. First to Trinidad, although actually migrants went to the Caribbean first to Guyana, which was then British Guyana, in 1838. They didn't, in fact, go to Trinidad until 1845. So in 1945, 100 years after they then celebrated their arrival in Trinidad. It's a complicated history, right? But a history that they tell with joy. And remember, with, well, a mixture of resilience and demonstration of their tradition. So this is Larisha Prasad, who danced for the Assemble Company. And I invited from Toronto the poet Janet Naidu to basically recite her poems and tell us about the origin of them. Then we also had awardees from the community who were awarded for their service to the community. Okay? This was all made possible by the Experiential Learning Grant. Okay? And it will continue this year. And I brought along with me Melody Sitar, who is going to tell us about her experience of attending Indian Arrival Day. You want to use the mic?
Sure. I do not have any slides, so. So last year in the spring semester, I had the privilege of attending Indian Arrival Day with my classmates. We heard from prominent community members about their histories and their efforts to maintain and preserve cultures in both the Caribbean and now in Canada. We got to see this in real time with elders talking about how they would read like religious Hindu scripts like in their living room in Hindi to small community members, as well as seeing some of the younger community members perform traditional dances. We also had the privilege of meeting Janet Naidu, both at this event, and she was actually able to come to our class. Her poetry is really beautiful, and it pulls from both the history we talked about in class and that history of indentured labor, which really kind of emphasized the relative recency of this history. Several of the older members of the community talked about how their grandparents had been the ones to come over through indentured labor, and also how the adaptation these communities had done to survive. We also had the privilege, I think Professor Alexander will mention in a minute, to visit the Winnipeg Central Mosque. Here we also saw the ways that migration impacted but also built community. Because of their minority status in Winnipeg, the mosque is built from several different Muslim members from several different countries and even different sects of Islam. This diversity is what allowed them to establish, but also had the side effect of sometimes flattening cultural practices from smaller minority members even within. The imam there also spoke to us about practical adaptations, about, literally Winnipeg in Canada, the sun rises and sets at different times. And so it's different, the prayer times are different, and having to consult more local scholars about when to pray, and when to do certain religious ceremonies because of the literal physical day and night differences that they would experience here as opposed to in more Muslim majority countries where the sun and night times are different. On a personal level, I have German and Ukrainian background, and while my family is not religious, all of the holidays we do celebrate are already carved out in Canadian days off, so it can be more difficult for me or other people who come from a place of privilege to kind of understand fully the adaptation that is done by these communities to continue cultural and religious practices. So I think both getting to speak to these people individually was very helpful in understanding how they had continued to do so and highlighting the impacts of migration to these different areas.
Thank you very much, Melanie.
I have to go now.
Thank you all. Thank you. And I skipped over one slide because it was, the other one, which was that one of the really interesting aspects of experiential learning that we also did in the last year was to visit one of the gurdwaras where we saw these photographs of the Komagatu Maru incident on the wall. In other words, what it is that is people are learning here about their connection to this resistance movement that occurred in British Columbia, right? And what I wanted to mention, and I was going to have another student talk about this, is that students, as part of experiential learning, are also writing basically mini histories of shops, gurdwaras, mandirs, temples, mosques, masjids, right? Of different individuals in the community. And in this, I am working towards putting together with students a history of South Asian Manitoba through institutions and people who have formed the community here. And so there, as you can see, there are many different aspects to the things that I've been able to achieve through the experiential learning grant in teaching students how to see South Asian Manitoba around them. Okay, thank you very much for the grant and for listening.